Hi, I'm Nick Malgeri for InnoBake, and I'm going to make a black and white birthday cake. It's wonderful devil's food layers and a white chocolate buttercream, finished off with a beautiful decoration of chocolate cards on the side and some rose piping on the top. So here I have flour and sugar that I'm going to mix together with baking soda and salt. And I always find it's easy to use a whisk to do that. This is assembled in kind of an unusual way for cake batters. The next thing we're going to do is I'm going to take some Cacao Ivory 74% bittersweet chocolate and place that in a bowl with my butter. And I'm going to pour over a cup of boiling water. So this water just ceased boiling a couple seconds ago. It's always good to boil the water and then measure it. Just kind of get this butter to sit in the hot water. Now, in a lot of devil's food cake recipes, people use hot coffee instead of boiling water, and that can work extremely well too. So it's going to take a minute or two for this to melt. It's always good to just give it a shake. You don't want to start stirring it up till it's all melted. But I'm just going to use a whisk to beat this smooth very quickly. And then I'm going to add the eggs and the vanilla. And you might be concerned that adding the eggs is going to be a problem here. But you see, melting the chocolate in with the boiling water lowers the temperature significantly. Now that the eggs and vanilla are added, we can add the sour cream. You can use yogurt. You could also even use buttermilk. So that looks good. And here's my flour, sugar, salt, and baking soda mixed together. So I'm just going to whisk that in a little at a time. About 3 additions is fine. And that is going to mix in very easily. That's one of the great things about mixing flour and sugar together. It makes it very easy for the flour to be absorbed without having any lumps. Okay, so here's our finished batter. And I'm going to put this into a couple of 8-inch round cake pans. Now these have been sprayed or buttered, whichever works for you. And we have a piece of parchment paper that is cut exactly to fit the bottom of the pan. The important thing about this is if it's a tiny bit smaller, it's fine. If it's bigger and goes up the sides, it's going to tear the cake apart when you try to pull the parchment paper off. So we're going to put about half of this into each. That looks good. The rest into here. So I'm going to put them right into the oven now. These need to bake at 350 degrees. They take 25 to 35 minutes. Next, we're going to make these marbled chocolate squares that we're going to use to finish off the side of our birthday cake. So in order to do that, I have some Cacao Ivory dark chocolate compound. Once it starts melting, it goes pretty quickly. So I like to stir it up a little bit to begin with to make sure that it's not starting to scorch on the bottom. That's why the best thing to do is to melt it over some slightly simmering water. Actually, that's a little bit more than slightly simmering. So I'm going to lower that a little bit. Melting it over simmering water isn't dangerous if you keep your eye on it. So with melting this, you can have it either, as I do now, over a double boiler. And if you're careful, you can have the water slightly simmering. Or you can, as I have now, turned off the heat and have the compound or chocolate melting really easily. Another way to do it is carefully in the microwave. Whether it's compound or chocolate, if you have it in a glass bowl or anything that's going to be non-reactive to the microwave, and melt it for maybe 20 to 30 seconds at a time, stirring in between. So this looks good. This is starting to melt. Sometimes if I know that the compound or chocolate has gotten really hot, I can take it off the heat before there are a few pieces left unmelted. But right now I want to make sure everything is completely melted and smooth. And then as soon as we finish this up, we're going to go to our white compound and melt that. So this again, I'm going to start it off with the water simmering. It's going to start melting very soon. Now I'm melting the white compound, and because it's a smaller quantity, it's going to start melting a lot more quickly than the dark was. Again, I'm making sure that every bit is melted. So my white compound is already melted here. So it's time to marble the two together so that we get to this point with the chocolate beautifully marbled with dark and white together. So here I've got a pan. This is just some parchment paper on the pan. And first I'm going to put the dark compound, scrape it onto the pan, and then spread it with a small offset spatula. Now, it's important not to spread it too thin, because if you spread it too thin, it's just going to break apart when you try to cut it. Now, one technique, and this makes a little bit of noise to make sure it's really smooth, is just to repeatedly drop the pan against the surface. Okay, now for the streaking, I'm just going to make a little paper cone. And this is just regular parchment paper like we have on the pan. We certainly made a generous amount of melted white compound here. So I'm going to fill it up nicely. So, closing up the top of my cone, I'm going to snip the base here with just a little bit. So now that I have the white compound in the cone, I'm going to streak the dark one, and one of the things that's important is to streak enough or else you're really not going to get much of a design. Okay, and then I'm using this is actually a skewer. That looks really nice. You can't overdo it or else it's just going to turn to a milk chocolate color and you won't have any streaks. So now one of the things I want to do is get this right at the perfect point of cutting it so that it's neither too soft or too hard. I'm just going to cut a few to show you how that goes. Here we go. Oh, I knew it. This is going to cut so beautifully. So what I try to do when I cut is press down, try to cut them so that they stay on the paper. Well, that's just not happening at all. So it's better to use a little knife to sever them rather than a finger, because then you get fingerprints all over. I'm always in favor of using both ends of the knife. You see that it's no longer sticky, but not fully hardened. Once these are all cut out, the best thing to do is to take a clean pan with paper on it, and you want to transfer these over. Again, remembering that it's best not to hold them from the top, but to move them over little by little. And we counted 13 before. I think that's going to be very sufficient to finish off the side of the cake. This one has a little nub. We're going to put these aside now and then get ready to prepare the buttercream. So I'm going to start our buttercream a little bit at the end, and I'm going to melt some cacao ivory white chocolate with a little bit of milk, and just put those together, and I'm placing them over the simmering water, and they're going to melt very quickly. So just give it a little bit of a stir occasionally. keep it moving nicely. And once it starts melting, it's going to go very quickly. So once this is fully melted, you want to set it aside until it's completely cooled, because we won't be able to add it to the buttercream until it has completely cooled. So we're going to make a Swiss meringue buttercream now. And to do that, we're going to put the egg white, sugar, a pinch of salt, and we're going to heat that up over simmering water with a vanilla bean. And what I like to do with the vanilla bean is just to use a scissors to kind of slice it down the middle. There we go. So that's going to go directly into there. And I'm going to use a whisk to mix them together. And then this is going to go over a pan of rapidly simmering water. And we want to heat this until all the sugar is dissolved and the mixture is hot. It's going to take about maybe 2 or 3 minutes. And you see, by agitating the vanilla bean in there, we don't have to go through all the trouble of scraping the seeds out of the vanilla bean, because mixing it with the whisk like this is going to take care of that. So we continue heating this till it's about 140 degrees. If you don't heat it that much, what's going to happen is you'll get a meringue that might be gritty, so some of the sugar hasn't completely dissolved. Also, it sanitizes it somewhat so that you don't have to worry about any kind of contagion in the eggs. And when I see steam coming out of the actual pan, or the actual mixing bowl, I should say, I know it's ready. We're going to move it over here and remove the vanilla bean. So the best way to do that is to use tongs. Comes right out. If you rinse this out real well under hot water, you can let it dry. And what I like to do with those used vanilla beans is put them in my sugar canister, and they will scent the sugar really beautifully. So we'll put the bowl on the mixer, and we need to whip it using the whisk attachment. It usually takes about 4 or 5 minutes. Looking into the bowl, and I can tell 2 things. One is I see that the meringue is really well whipped up, but the other thing too is when I touch the bowl, it no longer feels at all warm. So now I know that the meringue is finished whipping up, and we can proceed. So let me show you. This is a nice sticky meringue. So I'm going to get the excess off, and I'm going to switch to the paddle, and I'm going to add the butter all at once. And then we're going to go back to the mixer, and we're going to mix this until the butter is completely incorporated and emulsified into the meringue. So back to the mixer, this time with the paddle. This kind of a buttercream will often separate when you first mix the meringue with the butter. And some people panic when that happens. There's no need for it. Separating is kind of a normal part of the process. One thing I am going to do now, though, is I'm going to stop the mixer, and I'm going to take a clean rubber spatula and scrape down the bowl to make sure all of the meringue is mixing with the butter. That's really important. And then we're going to continue a little faster. Sometimes if your butter's very soft, which can certainly happen in the tropics, the buttercream will look very fluffy and it's still not emulsified. See, here I want to stop and show you. This is at that stage where the buttercream looks separated. but there's nothing wrong with it at this point. You just need to continue beating the buttercream, and it's going to come together beautifully. Once it does look smooth, we like to continue whipping it for about a minute or so to make sure that we have perfect smoothness. Near here now it's emulsified. Means that the temperature has gone up a little bit, and the butter and the meringue are now fully mixed together. Now that it's fully emulsified, if you have liquid flavoring to add to the buttercream, whether it be lemon juice or very strong coffee or half and half, chocolate and milk melted together, all of those can go in at this point. And now, of course, we have our white chocolate and milk that we melted together before so that we can add them. But first, I just want to show you how nice and smooth the buttercream now looks. It's really smooth. Actually, if you see it from this side, it looks very smooth. Okay, so in goes the white chocolate and milk that we mixed together before. And then we're going to beat that, not with the spatula in it. We're going to beat that until it's perfectly smooth. After it is, I want to take it off the mixer to show you how this looks so it's appetizing with the little flecks of the seeds of the vanilla bean throughout the buttercream. And we're good. Let me move these out of the way, and I'm going to bring the bowl of buttercream here so that you can see the smoothness. I'm just going to use my same spatula. And I think if we get very close to it, you can now see all those little specks of the vanilla bean that are contributing a really strong vanilla flavor. Next, we're going to unmold our cooled cake layers that we just baked, and then we're going to finish the cake. These are the layers we made a little while ago. They've completely cooled. And one of the things I like to do, this is kind of a sticky batter because it has a lot of sugar in it. So I always like to take either a spatula, small spatula, or a very thin knife and give a scrape before unmolding them. Now, very important to remember, scrape into the pan, not into the cake. So we've got that one done. We're going to do this one. And now we're going to unmold both of them and assemble the cake. Okay, that looks good. Now, when we assemble a cake, we always take the smooth bottom part of one of the layers to be the bottom of the cake. But what I'm going to do here is just take a little buttercream. Buttercream is excellent cement for cake finishing. And I'm going to affix it like that. That way it doesn't move while we're trying to assemble the cake. First thing I'm going to do is take some of the buttercream, not a ton, and I'm going to smooth that over. Here's an important hint about filling cakes. People love to do this and then make it all dome in the center. Oh, that's a real mistake, because if you get your cake layer to dome in the center, it's going to make the cake not have a straight top on it. Okay, I think that looks pretty good. So again, make sure it's straight. That looks good. Now we're going to unmold our other layer. And here, I'm going to transfer it to the top of the buttercream. Give it a good press down. Using a cardboard can make sure that it's going to be perfectly straight and flat on top. Now I'm going to remove the paper, and you see, I mentioned that before, that you don't want the paper to go up the sides of the pan. If it does go up the sides of the pan, this is what you would lose, that nice straight edge at the top. So here, you can see that the cake itself is nice and flat at the top, so we can go ahead and finish off the cake little by little. And I use an offset spatula, and it's a spread and one direction and then the other. Now, we don't have to be real scrupulous about making sure the side of the cake is perfectly smooth because the chocolate squares are conveniently going to cover it up. First step is to just cover. You want to just get everything covered with the buttercream. Second step, and first thing I'm going to do here though, is I want to clean off my surface so that there aren't any crumbs. I'm going to put this down and I'm going to put some on the top. Now to get finished the top surface, we want to make sure to cover really nicely. All right, next we go around the side and smooth, just holding that with my fingernail. You can see that some of the cake is peeking through. It's not really a big issue with this. And now we smooth the top straight and even. So now that we have the top of the cake nice and smooth, our next step is going to be decorating the cake. So here are the decorated chocolate squares we made before with the nice marbling. So first thing we're going to do is place the cake on the platter. And center it nicely. Next, we'll place the squares. We turn this so that we can see what's happening. We're going to place the squares next to each other on the side of the cake. You want them to have a little bit, I kind of like it when they sort of come to a bit of an angle like that when they're next to each other, so it doesn't look as though they're kind of plastered against the side of the cake. But I think that's a really easy and a fun way to make a really slick decoration for the cake. And the great thing about the marbled pattern is it doesn't matter which direction you put it in, it's always going to look very good. And here our last one, is we're going to just overlap it a little bit, okay? Before I decorate the top of the cake, I want to wipe off the platter. To decorate the top of the cake, I'm going to pipe some of the buttercream on, and it's this kind of new style rose piping. You know, in the past, we always made rosettes so that they kind of stood up from the surface of the cake. This is a little bit different. It's piping so that the rose appearance is a little bit more flat on top of the cake. Okay, and then continuing around, it's good if they overlap a little bit, and we manage to cover the entire top of the cake. And what's a birthday cake without a candle? InnoBake products come in lots of different forms besides the one we use today. There is butter, milk, and cacao ivory comes in both chocolates and compounds in blocks, buttons, and chips.